Hello. In this video, I'll be doing a light exegesis of Exodus 3:13 to 22, which is familiar to many people as the burning bush incident. This is the passage. I won't read all of it now, but you're welcome to pause the video or search it up and see how it's presented in this translation or other translations. In this video, I'll be focusing all of my analysis on the first few verses where God reveals his full name to Moses. This part of the passage reads as follows. Then Moses said to God, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" God's name is far and away the most important and deep part of this passage, so I'm going to devote this whole video to examining what it means and how it has been translated in a variety of different Bible versions. So on this slide, you can see that I have collected 8 different translations of God's name, including the Hebrew original, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. Rather than commenting directly on the Hebrew of the Masoretic text, let's look at how the name has been interpreted in these other translations. And this way we will get some idea of what the Hebrew means. So starting with the English of the New International Version, which reads, "I am who I am." It is quite uncharacteristic for the NIV committee to translate in a wooden and literal way. Usually they try to capture the sense of their understanding of a passage. They don't render a passage word for word. However, in this case, the translators have actually done just that. They have successfully captured a somewhat direct equivalence between the Hebrew words and the English words. That is, if you translate woodenly, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh does indeed simply mean, "I am who I am." However, the Hebrew also has many other connotations, and so could be validly translated in many other ways too. So considering this NIV version, "I am who I am," in context, it has the flavor of a rebuke or a refusal. Moses asks God, "What is your name?" And it's almost as if God thunders at him and slaps him around while saying, "You fool, I cannot be captured by any name. I simply am who I am. You cannot reduce me to a name." The irony is, of course, that this refusal of a name itself becomes God's name, and throughout Scripture, God comes to be referred to as "I am." So let's move on to the LXX, which is the Septuagint, the ancient and influential Greek translation of the Old Testament. So the Septuagint Greek does not quite reflect the same sense of refusal as the NIV English that we've just discussed. The Septuagint renders the name as ego eimi ho'on, which could be put into English as "I am being itself." The inclusion of the pronoun ego is not grammatically essential according to the rules of Koine Greek, and so the fact that it is used here is quite pointed and intensifies the reference. God is talking about himself not in a loose way, but in a profound and essential way. Ho'on translates in a word-for-word way as "the being," but the connotation is pure being, or being as such, or being itself. So the Septuagint Greek translation reveals God's name to be something like, "I am pure being." Now moving on to the Latin, this is the Latin of the Vulgate. It's quite similar to the NIV in that it is a literal way of rendering "I am who I am." If you were to translate the Latin here into English, it's very similar to that. The main thing to notice here is that in a similar way to the Greek, the Vulgate has included the optional pronoun ego. And this intensifies the reference to God's identity. This cannot be translated into English. It's very, very hard to convey. But it is possible to get some idea in English with syllable stress and tone of voice. So it's like, "I am who I am," rather than just "I am who I am." This can't be captured in written English, but with some syllable stress, you might get the idea. Now moving on to the RSV, this is the Revised Standard Version, and it reads, "I will be what I will be." Now this is very interesting because compared with the NIV version, it draws attention to the fact that Hebrew is not an Indo-European language. Hebrew is a Semitic language, and therefore in Hebrew, there's not really the idea of tenses. Indo-European languages have tenses, past, present, future, and different aspects. Hebrew just doesn't think in these categories, and so it doesn't have tenses in quite the same way that we do in English, Latin, or Greek. And so this leads to the funny situation where the NIV, which says "I am who I am," and the RSV, which says "I will be what I will be," even though in English these are dramatically different because of the utterly different tenses, technically they are both literal word-for-word translations of the Hebrew, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. And so in Hebrew, to say Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, when you say that, you are simultaneously saying "I am who I am" and "I will be what I will be." So God's name actually encompasses both of these English translations, despite the fact that the tenses are completely different. Arguably, ancient Hebrews didn't even really think in terms of tenses at all, so translating to English will always be somewhat problematic. Nevertheless, the Hebrew version of God's name can be understood to convey both the future and the present tense simultaneously. When we're thinking in English or Indo-European categories, there's no perfect translation from the Hebrew, but if you are going to translate from the Hebrew, you can understand it to convey both the future and the present. And therefore, both the NIV and the RSV complement each other quite nicely here. So one last thing to draw attention to is the fact that the NIV has a much more personal flavor because it uses the pronoun who. So I am who I am. Whereas the RSV takes a more impersonal approach because it uses the pronoun what. I will be what I will be. So this subtly but importantly changes the flavor of God's name in the two translations, insofar it is an answer to Moses' question, what should I call you? In the NIV, God is emphasizing his personal identity by saying, I am who I am. Whereas in the RSV, there's a more of a hidden quality to it because God is not talking about who he is, he's talking about what he is. He says, I will be what I will be. So the RSV has a less personal approach and the NIV has a more personal approach. Now, I'm going to move on to a more out there translation, but it's still a valid one. I couldn't resist. This is the Jehovah's Witness New World Translation, and they render God's name as I will become what I choose to become. This translation is loose, but arguably it does capture some important context and subtext in the original Hebrew. So this version is also incredibly theologically loaded and even quite controversial. Firstly, the Jehovah's Witness Translation Committee has chosen the verb become rather than the verb be. This alone is incredibly provocative because it brings to mind contemporary disputes between process theologians and classical theism. So the classical theistic tradition ascribes a variety of attributes to God, which simply contradicts the idea of any divine becoming. I'm thinking here specifically of immutability, impassibility, and aseity, although these are just some examples and there are others. So God announcing that he will become would at face value seem to deny these classical attributes because there cannot be any change in God, so how could he become anything? However, I think there's room for creative theologizing and hermeneutics here. Perhaps the word becoming, as it is used here, is just supposed to indicate the liveliness of God, as opposed to any idea of God as a static and abstract philosophical category. Let's compare with the Septuagint that we've already discussed. In the Septuagint, God says, I am being itself. Now, this is very abstract and distant, and it's not you can't really relate to this. It sounds like a static, dead category. Whereas in this Jehovah's Witness translation, I will become, arguably this captures the liveliness of God. God is alive, God is dynamic, God can surprise us. Even if all of the classical theistic attributes are true, nevertheless, this idea of God's becoming, it's almost like a tantric, very, very strange way to stimulate thought about God's liveliness. Now, another thing that jumps out here is that the J-dubs have included the word choose in the name. Now, this does not actually feature in the Hebrew, so this is not a word-for-word translation. This is not a wooden translation because the word choose does not feature in the original Hebrew. However, arguably, it is an appropriate word to include in the name. However, it's controversial because it may be understood to imply that God is a being, just like any other being, just like you or me, and he has to deliberate between different choices and then choose between different options, as if like God has to choose who he's going to be today. Is he going to wear a fedora or is he going to wear a flat cap? It's as if God's identity, he chooses day to day who he's going to be. Now, this is clearly unacceptable. There may be some Christians who believe this, but as Catholics, we can't accept that. But a more charitable reading of what the J-dubs are trying to say here could instead be that God is making a powerful statement about his divine freedom. Specifically, God is not forced to be who he is by some definition of divinity which pre-exists him and controls what he can and cannot be or do. Rather, God has the infinite divine freedom, and thus he is not forced or coerced into being who he is, but rather he freely embraces his own nature and his own identity. So there's no definition of God that he must meet, but rather he is the definition. He sets the definition. He chooses the definition. So he is who he is, not in the sense of him deliberating between different options, but in the sense that no one forces him to be who he is. There's no coercion. There's no definition of God that he must meet. He can freely choose to be who he freely chooses to be. So if the word choose here is understood just in that sense of uncoerced and free embrace, then actually it's quite a profound and appropriate word to include in God's name here. And arguably it is captured by the original Hebrew, even if it's not there word for word. We just have to remember that this is not to understand God forging himself in the fires of history and choosing between different options. We have to remember that even if we accept this translation, all of the attributes of classical theism still apply. Now, the next translation, which is also fascinating, is the Chinese Union version. In this version, God announces himself to be 我是自由拥有的. Forgive my tones. I'm not fluent at Chinese. Now, this translation is written in an almost ancient or classical Chinese grammar. So if you bring this to a modern Chinese speaker, they will actually have quite some trouble understanding what is being said. Even though you can pronounce it in Mandarin and you can say it like this is God's name, modern Chinese people will have to slow down. This is not everyday speech. This is quite profound. This is very deep. It's very dense, and it's very hard to put into English word for word. But my attempt would be this. God is announcing himself as, I am the self-existence which has always existed. Now, again, because Chinese is as far from English or Hebrew as you could be, like geographically, linguistically, there are many, many, many different ways you could render this in English, but this is my best attempt. So again, I am the self-existence which has always existed. Now, I don't want to get bogged down in discussing the intricacies of Chinese grammar, but in any case, this translation elegantly and concisely captures a variety of divine attributes as expressed by the Western tradition and the Eastern tradition too, including specifically this name of God includes the divine aseity, the divine eternity, and the identity of essence and existence in God. So once again, I am the self-existence which has always existed. So you can see there's aseity. He exists of his own self, like he does not require anyone else to exist. He has always existed, so that's the divine eternity. And then the fact that he says, I am these things, there's a sense in which the self-existence, which has always existed, like there's an identity of essence and existence here, and they're the same thing. So if Thomas Aquinas understood Chinese and he saw this, he would probably quite like it. He would quite like this way of rendering God's name because it captures that classic Thomistic theology of the identity of essence and existence in God. Finally, looking at today's Malay version, aku adalah aku. Malay does not have articles. There's no definite or indefinite articles in Malay. And so the capitalization of the second aku is supposed to convey the same sort of thing that we would capture with a definite article. So it provides a sort of definite emphasis. So in written Malay, it's emphasized with the capitalization. In spoken Malay, it would probably be emphasized with tone of voice. Now, literally, this could be rendered as I am the I. But the nuances conveyed here would translate to English as something like I am the supreme person, or I am the supreme personality, or I am consciousness itself, or I am personal identity as such. Now, this is fascinating. It's a fascinating emphasis on the personal nature of God. Like everything about this just screams personal. And this pairs nicely with the Greek emphasis on God. It's different. It's very, very complementary with the Septuagint Greek. There's no contradiction here, but when you put them side by side, you get a much, much better picture of God. Because in the Greek, the emphasis is on God as being itself. It's very abstract and philosophical and whereas in the Malay, the emphasis is on God's personality. So if you take this Malay rendition and together with the Greek version and you put them side by side and you understand that both of them technically accurately capture the original Hebrew, you come up with a picture of God where being itself has an intimate relationship with personality as such. Or in other words, personality and being are interchangeable in God. God is pure personality and pure being, or being itself and personality as such. And in the divine simplicity of God, these things are interchangeable. This could segue very nicely into a discussion of Trinitarian theology, but that's not the purpose of this video. It is quite mind-boggling, but the name of God in the original Hebrew manages to convey everything that we just spoke about, and translations into other languages draw more or less attention to particular emphases in the name. They amplify some dimensions of God's identity and nature, they pass over others. Now, the original Hebrew captures all of this quite concisely. But all of the different languages can only capture bits and pieces and emphasize certain parts in the original. So the name of God is fascinating in every language and every translation. And this video has only looked at 8 different renditions, but you could pick up any Bible translation and find some profound theology just in the name of God alone. Thanks for watching.